you guys having a good PAX so far? Woo! Welcome to Dorks versus Sports. This is where we will destroy. We'll put them against each other and we'll see who is the best and who will win. No, I thought about doing this panel because I am both a huge nerd and a huge nerd about sports. And I've been in circles where people are talking about min-maxing their elf ranger, and then I say, well, hey, I want to go watch this game. Let's go see who's playing basketball right now. And they look at me and, you know, throw me down and start beating me with their Nerf swords. And I'm like, why? Why are you doing this? And I think that, you know, in the spirit of what PAX is all about and what is brought to the gaming community is inclusion, and trying to bring as many different kinds of people into different kinds of fandom. And I think sports fandom is not as different from a lot of our fandom than you may think, you know, than we first realized. So I wanted to talk about that. That's what this whole panel is all about. And I'm joined by this illustrious panel. And as a way of introducing them, I'm going to ask them what their dorkiest moment ever in their life is, and their biggest moment of sports fandom, and they get bonus points if it's the same one. I'll just start with Mr. Bob Salvatore.
It's not usually what I talk about when I sit on panels, Greg, but I'm going to go for the bonus points because I have one that kind of qualifies for both. I got to go to the Super Bowl a few years ago down in Houston when the Patriots were playing the Panthers. And it was a really close game. And we had two sets of tickets. They got split up. And one set was like just overlooking the field on the first balcony, the best seats in the house. And the other ones were up at the 50-yard line, but they were way up top. And we felt bad because the guy who got us the tickets wound up with one of those. So we switched at halftime. And he was standing next to this guy who was about 5'2", little bald-headed guy. And I'll never forget, every time the Patriots did anything good, everybody was high-fiving, you know, and the whole thing. And then Vinatieri hit the kick to win the game at the end of the game. And I turned to high-five this guy who's like this tall, and he jumped up on me, spread legs, spread arms, and wrapped himself around me. And he's like burying his head in my shoulder, crying. And that was pretty dorky. So I'm going for the bonus points.
Nice. We're also joined by Sean Sands, who is a co-founder of Gamers with Jocks. Welcome.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm going to do bonus points as well. Going back to, I think it was '95 season. I'm from southern Wisconsin, which means I am a Packers fan. Nice. And this was the year that they went to the Super Bowl. I forget who they played. Some team from around here.
I got a story about that game.
Can't really remember, but I was obviously very excited. It was you know, it was shortly after I got a new apartment, and I'm in this place, an unfamiliar place. I'm feeling uncomfortable because this, you know, sports people kind of know you want the pattern that has worked all season because you're the reason they're in the Super Bowl, right? And if you move right before the Super Bowl, they're gonna lose. So I was like collecting things. So I had my Green Bay, I had my Brett Favre jersey, and then I had my hat, and then I went out and like bought a Green Bay Packer mug so that I could be drinking out of that. And then, like, as gate kick time got closer and closer, I started collecting more things around me. Like, I had been to the game earlier in the year, so I brought like the magazine from it. By the end, I had my toothbrush with me, which was a Packers toothbrush, and that's when my wife took a picture. That picture is the dorkiest thing you have ever seen in your entire life.
Nice.
I gotta put a little. That game, first of all, if you're Southern Wisconsin, wait a minute, if you're Southern Wisconsin, that's TSR, you're a dork as well. But that game when Desmond Howard ran back the kick for the touchdown,
MVP.
my phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Doug Niles and Troy Denning, two of my fellow authors from TSR, who lived in Wisconsin. And I answer the phone, and I hear Troy laughing in the background, and Doug Niles says, "Bob, it's Doug. That hurt."
That's pretty good. Having fellow TSR writers troll you. Yeah. I realized I forgot to introduce myself, in case you cared. I'm Greg Tito, managing editor of The Escapist, and my dorkiest moment and sports fandom moment was 2004. I'm a huge Boston Red Sox fan. Boston's the place to do this panel. I don't think it would work anywhere else. But I was watching the ALCS. I was living in Brooklyn, New York at the time, so being a Boston fan in New York is a whole different story. It was terrible. But my friends and I were all Boston fans, so we were watching together, and they lost game 1, they lost game 2 of the ALCS. They got killed in game 3. It was 18-3 or 18-5 or something. So we're like, okay, no, we're not going to watch this together. This is going to be horrible. So I'm at home watching it by myself on game 4, and I'm playing World of Warcraft. Kind of paying attention to the game. I had it on because I felt like I had to. And then I'm like just requesting the leveling, and it's the 9th inning, and you know what happens. Miller gets the walk, the steal, ends up hitting it. And so for the next 3 games of the ALCS, I was in my apartment playing World of Warcraft. Not with my friends, not doing anything that you would normally do, but I was making sure, similar to you, making sure that whatever was happening was as superstitious as possible. And I think I dinged a couple times. But we're also joined by Jason Schreier from Kotaku. And what is your dorkiest and/or sports fandom moment?
So I'm a Jets fan, but I guess that's just like the most heartbreaking moment. Our stupidest decision.
Yes, Sanchez.
He said he was going to leave if we made fun of the Jets. Let's keep it down to a dull roar.
Can we get a butt fumble?
Too much. So last year I was on Deadspin, which is our sister site that does sports, and I saw in one of the comments Chris Cluey, who's the punter on the Vikings, very big gamer. He wrote something ridiculous. They're talking about video games, and he wrote some like ridiculous story about Final Fantasy IV. And I was like, hey, like this guy's into RPGs. So I got his email address, I sent him an email, and we arranged like a phone interview. And I spent about an hour talking to Chris Cluey about how football is basically a JRPG. That was definitely a life highlight, because if you think about it, really, it's turn-based combat, it's attack, defense, like yards are like hit points, basically. So it works. So we just spent this hour geeking out about that, and that was a fun moment.
Nice. You kind of inspired the people to make Frozen Enzo, I think. Yeah.
Right. I don't know what that is, but sure.
The guys who are making Frozen Synapse are making a football game.
Okay.
That's turn-based strategy, basically, but football.
Oh wow, I have to play that.
Yeah, looks pretty good.
So that story almost makes up for being a Jets fan.
Almost. Keep applauding so he doesn't leave, that's all. We're finally joined by Rob Zachney, a freelance writer who writes for everything, basically, at this point. Yeah. So, what is your dorkiest and/or sports fan moment?
So they're not the same moment. I'm not going to get the bonus points. My dorkiest moment, though, was I used to run a D&D campaign, 3rd edition, and this was kind of the high water mark for me as a DM. And when your D&D group gets big enough that you've got like 12 people trying to join your game for one session and you can't say no, you end up with what I basically ended up doing, which was holding a huge mega session on the deck of my house, lit by tiki torches. And I kid you not, the entire linebacking core of my football team and 2 defensive tackles and 1 offensive tackle were in my group. And I was a tackle as well. So that was half the group. But for atmosphere, because atmosphere is very important when you're hosting a D&D session. Are any of you familiar with the soulful works of Lorena McKennitt? Yeah. So I bring out a stereo, and we put on Lorena fucking McKenna, because that is the most D&D music you can possibly have. So we're playing D&D, and it's 12 people, so it takes us 8 hours to do one encounter, and the night's over. And we're listening to the same 2 Lorena McKenna CDs on repeat for like 8 hours. I basically memorized the entire Highwayman at this point. But at the end, I like, we're breaking up, and I'm looking at the football guys, and I'm like, this can never get out. This can never happen. My favorite sports moment of all time, though, for a variety of reasons, was shortly after my parents' house flooded, like in 2008. They were living in like a rental, and it was just a shitty time in our lives. And we're all F1 fans, and like I think it was 2008 or 2009. Because any of you F1 fans, you might remember this. It came down to the last race, basically the last lap of the last race of the season. The Brazilian Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton and Felipe Massa were dueling for the championship. If Felipe Massa won and Lewis Hamilton placed lower than 8th, Felipe Massa was the world champion. If Hamilton placed 8th or higher, he was going to be world champion. So Hamilton had a shitty race. He's basically out of contention. It's driving rain. It looks like this is a done deal. But after lap after lap after lap through this like monsoon, he's chasing him down. He's passing cars. And in the last turn, as Felipe Massa's already won the race, he's celebrating. His parents are weeping and everything. Hamilton catches the car he needs to catch, like a phantom, like through this curtain of rain. The car appears. He's passed him. He wins the world championship at the last possible minute. This was also one of the first times I brought my girlfriend home to hang out with me and my family. Okay. So she's watching it. She's still in the sort of the getting to know us phase for me and my family. And for the last like 5 laps of that race, F1's kind of an esoteric sport, so it's hard to know what the hell people are getting excited about. But for the last 5 laps of that race, all like me, my mom, my dad are all on our feet, screaming at these cars, just driving through the rain. Basically, you can't see much. We're all just like, go, scream, and we're all just like cheering, screaming, and hugging, as after the race ends. And my girlfriend's a good sport, and that was actually when she converted to becoming an F1 fan. But really, I think my favorite part about that memory was, it was kind of the first burst of normalcy we had after we lost my parents' home. So it was like, if we had sports, it was going to be, okay, it was going to be back to normal.
That's a really cool point. For many people, sports does that almost as much as gaming does. Bob, I'd like to ask you, what do you think brings those two together? What is that thing that people get so glommed on about their gaming and their sports fandom?
Well, in a way, I think both, I don't want to say this wrong, but it's almost like living vicariously through the heroes you're watching, whether it's in a game or on a sports field. And for me, it's competition. Anything that's competition gets me going, period. I don't care what it is. Words with friends, I'll kill you. Oh, and true story, by the way, I actually write to Lorena McKenna. I'm not kidding.
I tried that once too. I'm not a fiction writer.
Do you two want to sit closer to each other now? Please sing a few bars, everyone. No.
But no, I think that's true though. It always cracks me up because I think no matter what you're talking about when you talk about popular entertainment, there's so many similarities. It's like arguing religion, right? If you're arguing sports against gaming, it's the same thing. Everybody wants the same thing. I always cracked up at the guys who would put on the Civil War uniforms and go to Gettysburg, making fun of me for going to Gen Con. It's like, dude, you're doing the same thing. So, but I think there's that whole heroic aspect of sports and gaming that, what else are you gonna do?
Right. You mentioned Gen Con, and I've been there a few times in Indianapolis, which is a big football town, obviously. And my favorite part of Gen Con usually happens in August. So there's preseason football games going on Sunday. And Gen Con, much like PAX, has many people walking around in chainmail and all kinds of cosplay. Very big swords and battle axes, and they're walking one way, and then on the other side of the street is everyone decked out in Indianapolis Colts gear with face painted, all blue, and they just stare at each other. Which will make make any comments, and I always, you're right, there's so many similarities between those two. They both have their fanatics that love to express themselves with what they're wearing, and what gets me is this stereotype that many gamers have lived with for a long time, that the jocks have been putting us down, and stuffing us in the lockers and doing all these things that have been making fun of our hobby. And so I feel like somehow there's this need to reciprocate that upon sports. So Sean, I don't know if you want to be able to talk about that.
For $5, you can hire the cosplayers to whack the Colts fans.
They have a lot more badass weaponry.
Yeah, they'll do it. $5, I'm telling you.
They really will.
Well, I mean, I think it's culture. I mean, I think that you're on to the whole idea, which is that. So when I was growing up, I was a gamer first, and then I started playing basketball and football and doing these other things, and I couldn't game. I mean, I could, of course. You can kind of do your own thing, but because that culture is sort of out there, it's like you have to choose a side, like which side are you going to be on. I think the nice thing is that barrier is breaking down. Like now they cross line, each other peacefully. That wouldn't have always been the case. But the thing that I think is important, and that goes going back to the earlier question partly, that connects the two is passion. Because in both of those situations, I was actually able to fill the same need. So when I was a gamer, I had that fire, I had that kind of hero, that passion, that real energy into it. And when I played sports, it was really serving the same idea. It was serving the same part of me. It was fulfilling that same need. So that was one of the things as I kind of crossed over, and then I grew up and went, okay, I can do whatever the hell I want. I'm a grown-up now, and did both. Then I realized how closely those two ideas are attached.
That's funny, I had the exact same experience after I got married, and I was prevented from playing D&D by my parents because they were largely religious. So then I got married and I moved to New York and I was living by myself, and I was like, wait a second, I'm an adult now. I don't have anyone who can tell me what to do. So I jumped right into all of that. I was always into stuff like that. But Jason, I wanted to ask you something. One of the greatest moments that I think proves the point of this panel was over here. These guys were talking about football and the Patriots contracts and what was happening over here. And over here, you guys are talking about the min-maxing of your StarCraft battles. And I've heard many people say that fantasy football is one of the greatest video games ever created. How can people who are fans of both of these still think of them as two separate things?
It's funny because you always hear people who are, and then sometimes people who are kind of demonizing like the jock culture, who are like, oh, fantasy football is just role-playing as a football team owner. And that's really not true. If you played fantasy football, you're not really pretending to be a team manager unless you're playing some weird game of fantasy football that nobody really plays. It's more of like a statistical game and a game of numbers and figuring out what numbers work best and how to make the best decisions for your team on any given week based on the knowledge you have available to you. So it's basically a strategy game. And it's interesting because it appeals to the same parts of your brain that something like football or baseball might appeal to. So yeah, it is interesting that there's that kind of dichotomy between something like them talking about football and us talking about StarCraft, especially when you look at how people talk about sports these days, because there's so much conversation about who's making what and what kind of contracts will fit into the salary cap, and it's like everybody's a math geek. You have to be a math geek to enjoy sports nowadays. So yeah, there is kind of a parallel, and I think that more and more you're starting to see those interests intersect.
Rob, you were saying, actually over email when we were talking about this earlier, that you wanted to kind of address the stereotype that somehow it's possible for us to get back at the jocks who had done this to us. Why do you think that exists, that kind of idea?
Well, I don't know that I'd put it like that. There's this collective nerd. I don't know. It's weird. The way I put it to you in the email is, in some ways, like nerd culture is almost like defined by like Revenge of the Nerds, basically. In some ways, like this collective memory that none of us actually experienced. Like, what experienced like aspects of it, but very few of us were like, you know, nerdlinger, you know, battling the dumb jocks and getting stuffed in lockers. I mean, of course, I was like 6'1", 250 pounds by the time I was a freshman in high school, so I was kind of in my own independent state of like nerd jockistan. But so I mean, it's possible maybe this stuff was like just happening. I wasn't aware of it, but I do think it's weird that like I think wanting to belong is a powerful force, and it's a powerful force in any sort of subculture. And so the moment like there's this idea that there's an identity you're supposed to adopt to truly belong, that becomes a very powerful force for you to begin to interpret the world, like your experiences in the world, through that lens. And I sort of watched it happen, you know, just in, you know, various discussions and like gaming forums and the way gamers interacted and the way they related to the sports world, as if there was this sense of resentment or grievance that was supposed to be felt, or the sense of alienation. That's actually maybe the word I'd use for it. There's this sense of alienation you're supposed to feel to a lot of mainstream things, sports just being the most salient, if you're a true nerd. And I think we're getting away from that, and thank God, because, you know, it means that you don't have to buy nerd culture, you know, the whole kit and caboodle. But I do think that's kind of, I think that was a powerful force in creating this idea that somehow if you have to choose one or the other, you can be into sports or you can be really into games and RPGs. But if you want to do both, you kind of don't belong to either.
Right. And how was it like, I mean, going back to how you were describing your football team playing RPGs, how did you recruit them? Were they all into it already, or was this like...
Oh God, yeah. Like one of the biggest, beefiest, meanest tackles on the team was like talking, Jesus Christ. When he was going off to college, when he was starting his freshman year, he was like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna buy a kimono. Shopping for kimonos, because in addition to being a huge RPG nerd, naturally he was on manga and anime and the bonfire. So he was like, you know what I really need is wall scrolls. Wall scrolls. And so, I mean, that was the thing. Like, there were other guys who were total annihilation junkies. Like, one of the best receivers on our team just played that was his only RTS. That's what he played. Like, he wasn't a huge gamer, but he loved him some Total Annihilation. So it was, I think it was always there, and it was just kind of a willful ignoring of that reality that sort of led to this dichotomy.
You probably had the best high school ever, also. Just putting it out there.
Yeah.
Was the team good? Did you guys win?
We were good, not great. So we could like every few years we could win our local conference. Never came close to the state championship ever.
Maybe if you would spend less time gaming, more time practicing.
Wait a minute, Ron, how old are you?
Pardon?
How old are you?
I'm 29.
See, I think you just identified something right there, and you're nodding because you know what I'm saying.
I know what you're doing.
These stereotypes that nobody ever lived through, oh yeah, they did. It just happened before your time. If you go back to the 70s when I was in high school, oh yeah, believe me, there were, if you ever get a chance, watch the show Freaks and Geeks, okay? Freaks and Geeks is one of the best shows ever made. And it takes place 1980, 81 in high school. That was high school in 1980, 81. And you really weren't crossing boundaries. I think you are a lot more now, and it's probably because of the internet and social media and all the rest of this, and fantasy football and things like that. And when I started writing, probably when you were born, the only women in fantasy novels were chicks in chainmail, or on the covers, or damsels in distress. It was my early book signings in the late '80s were 95% teenage boys, and now they're about 50-50 men and women. So I think that whole culture shift has happened, and you missed it with the part you're talking about, because it was very, very different. Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right. I was there kind of mid-shift, so I mean, kind of during the détente phase of that. Where we're like, we're not going to stuff you in a locker, but we are looking at you the way you think we're looking at you. Because no, I was on all those teams. Nobody played video game. Nobody played D&D. Nobody did these things, and you weren't allowed to really. I mean, that was the thing. It wasn't where you could kind of break that. I'm going to be the trailblazer. Nobody wanted that trailblazer at that time. But it was kind of shifting at the same time. I mean, within like 3 or 4 years after my brother, who is 12 years younger than me, had a completely different experience, obviously, but I mean, just not even close to the way I experienced school.
I wonder if part of the reason for that change is the popularity of sports video games like Tech Mobile and NBA Jam. So, like, your average jock, maybe in the late 80s, 90s, might come home and also play video games, just different video games than the ones that the nerds were playing. So you'd have the jocks coming home and playing NBA Jam, and the nerds coming home and playing Final Fantasy or whatever. Totally me. And so they're both playing games, kind of, and it's like they did have a lot more in common than they might have before.
Well, maybe it's just video games.
That's what I was going to say.
When I was in high school, we didn't have computers. No, serious. Nobody had a computer. I remember, I think it was my senior year of high school, they came out with this thing that you could plug on your TV and play Pong. You know, it was a completely different world.
I think what you bring up is arcades also had a lot to do with it, because there was and that's why I think it was a regional kind of thing. So like if you experienced that kind of bullying, you know, where you grew up, it was in Worcester, right?
Central Mass.
Yeah, so that specific town had something like that going on, and then you could go 2 towns over and have a completely different experience. I mean, it was similar. They weren't playing, you know, RPGs like Rob's team was, but perhaps weren't as terrible. Because that's the way I experienced it in my high school. For some reason, my senior class, liked each other. It was really odd. We all hung out, and every single time I tell this to someone, they're like, dude, I hated high school for all these reasons, this, and, you know, everyone just got drunk, or there was, you know, sexism and everything all over. And I'm like, we actually just kind of hung out, and we're really kind of cool with each other. Maybe it's because we all smoked pot, I'm not sure. But there was, you know, this weird kind of confluence of many factors. So I feel like if there was an arcade or some kind of gathering point in the community where the nerds could see the jocks playing the same things that they're playing, you know, there was a cross-pollination that was happening. There's not a question there.
Yeah.
But
well,
Rob's going to talk.
There's something I wanted to bring up though too, and I think a lot of people's early experiences with sports, though, or at least if you're of a certain generation, those early experiences with sports tended to be traumatic. I turned out to be okay at sports, but I discovered this when I was in my teens, basically. But before that, when my experiences were Little League and everything, sports were just these terrifying gauntlets of like public shaming, being abused by your elders, that sort of thing. And what I think, one thing I think that sort of created a wedge, and I think it's one reason you see sort of a gaming culture still kind of cautiously embracing esports, they're kind of wary of esports, is that in a lot of ways, like, sports have become really divorced from play, really divorced from fun, especially when you're a little kid. The tragedy is that's when it should be the most fun, that's when you should be the freest to, you know, enjoy it and play the game. And if you'd like to play games when you're little, in like a middle American town, you play video games, because Little League, that ain't gonna be a game. That's some serious shit. Yeah. And I think that's toxic for kids' relationships to sports, and I think that's one reason actually sports audience has shrunk a little bit. But and I think when you should look at video games, I think that's one reason why there's sort of a hesitation about esports as well, because you see some of the same hyper-competitive elitist values starting to infiltrate our hobby again. And it's, you know, it's kind of cool to see someone play StarCraft really, really well. But at the same time, I just want to play StarCraft. And yeah, if you go to the StarCraft forums or StarCraft Reddit, it's all about, what league are you? Oh, you're a gold leaguer? Shut the fuck up. You don't get to talk. And that's I worry about that.
You bring up too, you know, that the sports culture can sometimes be sexist or racist and have all these weird things that happen within it, and obviously we've been trying to change all that over the course of all of history. But do we think that that kind of reluctance also comes from the idea that gamers are inclusive and trying to be as inclusive as possible.
I don't know that, I'm kind of with Ron on this one. I think that Rob at this one, they were, I think, once upon a time, when I played EverQuest. Yeah. And you know, you needed that wizard to teleport you, and you needed that priest to res you, and you were all sitting on the dock for 15 minutes waiting for the damn boat. You know, it was inclusive. You had to make friends because soloing was hell, right? So you had to make friends. But I've noticed the change. I'm looking at your DPS meter, dude. You're out. Boom. Right? And I've noticed the change. I think video games, the online games, have gotten harsher. They've gotten more elitist, if you will, and it really gets pathetic sometimes when it goes overboard.
Yeah, and we see that happening with esports, like you're saying. Like there was the controversy this year of the fighting game genre and how so much abuse was heaped on people, and perhaps the reluctance to embrace that kind of thing has been part of this response that people have. Oh, I hate sports. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I agree. I feel a little bit like we're painting with big brushes here, and I think it really depends. I think there are clearly game communities that are toxic, and StarCraft 2 is an interesting one because I think there are toxic elements into it, and I think you can go deep into the weeds and find what you're looking for. But also, there's a lot of parts of it that are really inclusive and that do have that element to it. I think you just have to be intentional about, and I think you have to do this with sports too. Like, you all know your favorite sports team. You've been in the stands or you've been wherever, you know, watching a game, and there's the guy representing your team, and you're like, God, just shut up! You're making us look so bad. Like, there's that guy, you know, the drunk guy who every time there's a touchdown, he spills beer on the guy next to him. I never did that.
I was waiting for someone to admit to that.
The bad elements are always out there, but I just don't want to paint with too big a brush, because there are the good elements. Even in those really competitive games, sometimes that competitiveness is exciting and everybody gets energized, but they kind of energize one another. So yeah, I guess I just want to be careful about the broads.
You bring up a good point, because I remember when I was in college, when I was younger, I loved going to college basketball games. I went to the University of Connecticut, and it was 2 hours. Yes, whatever. The Big East is dead. I don't care anymore. But it was 2 hours where I could scream and say whatever the heck I wanted. Hell, I wanted. I said very, very awful things, and I'm sure people around me, some of them were like, ha ha ha, you're funny, and some of them were like, shut the fuck up, seriously. Like, you know. So, but the game made me feel that passion and get that really into it, and that's where my enjoyment came from. And I think a lot of the anger and angst that we see in esports and some online games comes from that level of passion and competition. It's just when it goes too far.
And I think it's also out of context too. So you have this really passionate, exciting experience with somebody, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
You never see them in a different context. So you can see you in that context and think, Greg's kind of a dick when he watches Connecticut, you know, or something like that. But it's just this one element, because then you're back and you go into this different context. So we only have this one image of the people we play against in video games, as opposed to being a sports fan and being at the arena and then following out later with your friends or something.
Right. You have that like decompression period where you go back into normal society.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist online. But to shift tracks a little bit, you mentioned Chris Cthulhu, and he wrote a really good SimCity review too that I was kind of impressed with. What was it like talking to him? Did it feel like he understood both worlds very well?
Well, he's a punter, so I don't know how well.
Is Chris in the audience? I hope we didn't offend him.
I'd like to welcome Skip Bayless to the panel.
But I'm a Jocks fan, so I don't know how well I understand. Yeah, no, Chris, he was definitely a hardcore gamer, as hardcore as it gets. He like brought up all sorts of RPGs. Like I asked him what his favorite was. He said like I think Ogre Battle for the Super Nintendo. So he's an old school gamer, and I think he might be one of the very few in professional sports, at least for now. Well, what was the question you were asking?
I wanted to kind of bring him up to talk about there's this huge proliferation with professional gamers, professional athletes, who have probably at first didn't want to talk about how much they were into gaming, but now I feel like in the last 5 years have come forward and been like, I play games all the time.
Yeah.
Sports are great, but there's a lot of downtime, and I fill it when I'm away from my family by playing these games.
Yeah, it's funny. I just saw the other day LeBron James, the basketball player, LeBron James.
You don't know anybody not familiar? I'm sorry, hang on.
I don't have a slide in.
LeBron James, it's 2 words. He tweeted like, oh, I just saw the Crisis 3 trailer, that looks sick. And I wondered, at first I thought it was funny, and then I wondered like 10 years ago with that, I mean obviously we didn't have Twitter 10 years ago, but would an athlete say something like that? And I don't know, and I think as athletes, like today's athletes are mostly in their 20s or in their 30s, they grew up playing video games, just like any other 20 or 30 something did. So that's an interesting dimension to it, and yeah, you're constantly seeing athletes supporting Call of Duty and Madden, of course, and the NBA games, and a lot of it's becoming a lot cooler in our culture today to be a geek in general. So I think a lot of athletes are feeling more comfortable being like, yeah, I'm a giant nerd, whatever, no big deal.
Hey Greg,
Do it. Yeah.
should I mention 38 Studios?
You probably should. I have a slide for it and everything.
There you go. I'm sitting in my house, another geek and sports moment. I'm sitting in my house doing an e-signing for one of my books, where people buy the book online and then I sign them and we ship them out. And my phone rings and I pick it up, and the guy on the other end says, "Can I talk to Bob Salvatore?" I said, "Talk." He's speaking, and he said, "Oh man, I can't believe I'm talking to you. My favorite author, this is Kurt Schilling." And I went, "Screw you." And I'm looking at my wife and she's laughing because his publicist had called. It was Kurt. He's a huge gamer, and he's not the only one. I mean, he took me into the clubhouse one time, and half the Red Sox were huge gamers.
Wow.
And Kurt was turning everybody in Major League Baseball onto gaming. He's an absolute geek. He is 10 times the geek I have ever been. I'm serious. This guy, he played computer games days straight between starts when he was pitching.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
He did. I interviewed
His
him.
office in his house, he's got like 4 screens so he can play like in the world.
That is amazing.
Huge geek.
Yeah. I remember when I interviewed you guys about Amalur when it was coming out, he said, yeah, that he had an off day and he wasn't due back at the thing. He gamed for like 26 hours straight.
Yeah.
No pee breaks or anything.
So much of a geek, he spent $50 million of his sports money trying to make an MMO.
Right.
That's pretty geeky.
Awesome.
You don't have to sell me on it, I'll trust you.
All right, well, I wanted to kind of open it up to questions from you guys, but I'm sure you have something you want to open to you guys, so feel free to come forward. We have a microphone here somewhere. So, I never remember to actually go to questions in these panels, so I'm actually happy that I did for this first round. Because it ends up being like an hour and 45 minutes. People are like, stop, I want to ask you a question. Go ahead.
I want to say, do you think that maybe some of the hostility between sports fans and geeks is definitely coming from us at this point? Because for the longest time, we were the losers. We were the not cool kids. We were the ones getting stuffed in lockers. I mean, vicariously, a lot of us didn't experience that, but that's like the image we have. And now it's cool to do that. And the jocks are like, hey, I'll get in on that too. And it's like we spent so much time feeling like the ones on the bottom, and now we're pissed that they're trying to join our club. It's like, you have your club, keep your club. We want our club.
Anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I just, that whole hierarchy of high school. I always feel like this is always, we're always talking about high school really when we're talking about this dichotomy.
Pretty much.
Yeah. The people at the bottom of the totem pole in high school weren't the people who were like nerds or a little too dorky into the wrong thing. It was the kids who didn't have a lunch table to go to. And that's the thing that gets lost in this conversation a little bit is that, really, it might have seemed like the jockey table was the glamorous table. That was where, the school's winners were, and then there was the nerd table and the slacker table and all that. But like, if you were really into games and you were sitting down every day and like rallying with your people and talking about this awesome game you're excited about, you still had your club and you were still fine in a lot of ways. It was just as much fun to be there. It was more fun, in fact, to be there than it was to be at the sports table. So I don't know. I always feel like there's this protectiveness, like that. If you define yourself by your alienation from the people who are into sports, you tend to overlook the fact that you had something that brought you together too.
I totally think it's a valid. I just want to jump in real quick. I think it's a valid way to feel, but it's very close to the hipster mentality of like, well, I liked that band before you did, so then that means I'm cooler than you, and I feel like that. Kind of thinking can be just lead down a very negative path. So I get it. I'm trying to find you, so I can look at. Oh, right there you are. I totally understand that mentality, and I've felt it a few times myself. But I think we need to, realize that it's not. It's so pervasive now that we can't just shut people out for not getting on the bandwagon fast enough. Honestly, good question though. Thank you. Next.
All right, so sports, as far as what this country knows, has been going on for, 100 years, give or take, a couple of decades. Do you think that when sports just started catching on, like in the 20s and 30s, it got the same kind of cultural resistance of sort of, like, what are you barbaric, how dare you enjoy that kind of actions? Like, I feel like that's the same kind of, you may have gotten the same reception video games got for those first couple of decades when it was getting off the ground.
I'm going to let Bob answer this question because you were live back then.
Close. I don't think so. I mean, if you go back and look at, when I used to go watch Red Grange play, no, I don't think so, because, sports really goes back to the Olympics, right? It goes back to ancient Greece, it goes back beyond that. And it was always the physical part of it was always like applauded, I think, in every culture through this. So I don't think so. Now, I do think that as video games find ways to attract huge audiences and advertisers for the World Series of StarCraft or whatever, you'll probably start seeing them become even more mainstream, because it's all about the money, right?
Also, favorite sports video games, all of you?
Tecmo Bowl, definitely for me. Yeah.
I'm just going with Tecmo Bowl.
Everybody, Tecmo Bowl?
Totally.
Consensus. Okay. Well, you can say it, you're good.
I really liked NHL 11. I think it was NHL 11 because, well, it could have been the NHL games have been really good for the last few years, but was it NHL 11 that had a Blackhawk on the cover? John Taves? Well, then right on. See, if you're a Chicago sports fan though, like seeing one of your guys on the cover of a video game, you're like, oh my god, we don't suck. Oh, this is amazing. It's like Jordan's alive again. Like, it's like Jordan's alive again. It's like Jordan's back.
Jason, do you have a sports video game? You said you didn't play them, so I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could be like a douchebag and be like, oh, StarCraft 2 is my favorite sports game.
You could be a douchebag.
I liked NBA Jam. That was my
NBA Jam. Boom shakalaka.
I'm still thinking my Tecmo.
What's that?
Do you have a sports video game that you've
When
ever
I was
played?
growing up, we had this little board that had these things that you would pull in and out.
That counts.
We had a football game that you plugged in and everything would vibrate. You had that, and the players would fall over.
Next question.
My name is Jesse. I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. Appropriate response. Thank you.
He's wearing his colors today too. Well done.
Hey, I like the Bills. It's 2 wins a year.
I actually wanted to ask. You guys touched on sexism within the two a little bit, and I kind of see a similarity. Maybe you guys could discuss. Between the sports and gaming communities, the barrier to entry for women seems to be about as high in both places. My wife is an enormous sports fan and enormous geek, and I think women more often are, their true fandom or their true geekhood is always questioned, rather than men who are just assumed. So maybe you guys could speak to that, whether that's coming from the same place, or are you a true fan type of thing when we see that.
I mean, I think the part of the issue is that we're segmenting two parts out of a larger whole, which is that sexism is alive and well and pretty much everywhere, right? There's a lot of it out there. I think, I think there has been, almost a disturbing amount though in the gaming news and sort of the way the gaming interact, it's just been really exposed lately. I don't think it's like new or that it's different in some way. I think it really is, we're reaching that point where a lot of people sort of assume gaming is this sort of tepid culture that, all inclusive. In fact, it has all the same great things and all the same bad things that all the other communities have. We're just sort of seeing it more now.
Does anyone else want to? All right, cool, thank you, good question.
So he actually kind of stole my question, but I will see if I can...
I can say all that again, I don't know.
So, just speaking from kind of personal experience, I've always been a jock, but I never got into the culture of watching sports, and I've always been a gamer, but I wasn't necessarily maybe I wasn't playing the same games as everyone else, so I've always enjoyed playing, but maybe not watching or watching other people play. So, I mean, it seems like one of the things that sports do is there's this kind of division between people who play and people who watch, and you don't have to play to be a huge sports nerd in that way. And I was just wondering if, kind of pushing the culture of gaming right now, if there's any kind of relationship to the spectatorship that's increasing, or that. And then the second thing is just also sometimes it's not even a barrier to entry in that people have true nerddom and it's not accepted, but sometimes it's you weren't invited into the club at an early age, so you never got the geek cred that you did that everyone else had. And so entering these at a later stage in your life when maybe you're not familiar with all of the big 8-bit titles, or you're not familiar with the NES and all of that stuff, there's a really kind of hostile reaction to that. And I think this goes back to something that you guys were all talking about before, this is our community, you have to show your badge to get in. So, I don't know your response.
With the question? I agree with everything you're saying.
So I guess two things, just the spectatorship and not having to play in order to kind of get into the culture.
Yeah.
And also just how do you guys feel about geek cred in general? Because I personally feel it's a very kind of...
Well, the sports stuff, sports cred's there too. So, every time I say I'm a Packers fan, if it's the season they had a couple of years ago, or I have to qualify that I'm a Packers fan, and I have been since Don Majkowski was quarterbacking, and then people know, okay, he's cool, he's a Packer fan, because nobody was a fan when Don Majkowski was quarterbacking. And I just think it's the same sort of thing. Is people want to know. People who are deep in it, they want to know that they can have that same connection. Because it does, in the one sense, it is alienating, but it's alienating because there's this tight-knit group that happens in there. When you know that somebody knows and has those experiences of the tough times, or, when all we would do was play 8-bit games, and it was my red blob versus your blue blob. I think both sides have that the same way.
I have to say too that I think a lot of how we associate our love of gaming and love of sports, love of anything really, comes from the home. It comes from how you grew up. And if there is the cultural thing in your house that, the guys go in and watch football while the girls are in there making, I think it's terrible, but it happens in a lot of places. And that's just how you think about your sports fandom. And so then when someone crosses that line, it's oh, I want to get involved, it's hard for people to shift from what they grew up with. And I think it's noble to try and do that. And actually, I thought too late to invite a woman to speak on this panel too, because I do know so many women fans of sports and women gamers, and I was already full up and I didn't have to do, but I did think of it, and that counts or something. No, but it's a problem, and I feel unless we identified it like we're doing now by talking about it, that it will just continue. So thank you for bringing that up.
Definitely, as far as spectatorship goes, there's definitely a barrier. I mean, and I think part of that is showing an understanding of the sport, right? I go to the Red Sox games with my dear sister-in-law who loves the game, watches the game, but somebody will hit a pop-up and she'll be like, yay! And everybody around us will just go. And, you know, there's a lot of derogatory remarks thrown at people who aren't like die-hard, grew up with it and understand everything about it, even in the stands. Absolutely. You see it all the time. It's almost like people think like, why are you in that seat instead of someone who really gets it, you know? And how is anyone ever going to really get it if they don't get in that seat in the first place? But yeah, I think there is a lot of that.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Mike from Pittsburgh, so let's go Pens, let's go Bucks, and here we go Steelers.
No Pirates though.
Oh no, that's the Bucks. The
Your
Bucks.
team is older than me.
My question is, you guys brought up the fact that most pro athletes are in their 20s and 30s now, so they're at around the average gamer age. Do you think another reason why so many pro athletes are gamers are because so many athletes use gaming as a scouting tool? You always hear about NASCAR drivers using the newest NASCAR game to learn about the track, learn where all the divots are. Golfers using Tiger Woods to learn about the courses. Football players scouting out the other teams. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, that's an awesome point. We should have brought it up earlier. So
Yeah, kudos to you, sir.
Would you like to take my seat on the panel? I have to tell you, you mentioned Pittsburgh. I grew up, or I lived in Pittsburgh for 4 years. Now it happened to be the 1977 through 1980 run.
We are family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When Pittsburgh sports was pretty good at that time.
Yeah.
That was actually where I developed a love for sports. So good job, your city.
But yeah, I think sports games have increasingly played that role of not just a scouting tool, but a way to learn about the game. Like, I mean, there's a game on the show floor this week, iRacing, iRacing.com, which is like the hardest of the hardcore racing games. Like, I'm a huge racing game fan. I can't play that game. But if you go and join that community, and if you skill up, you will find yourself racing against actual professional race drivers who use it as a tool for practice, because running a race car, having a track day is expensive. Putting in like 8 hours on a pretend race with like serious rules enforcement and everything, and talking about like those little divots on the track and everything, having all that modeled is a huge competitive advantage. And I think something similar happens, probably to a lesser extent, with like EA Sports games, like, you know, hockey and football. But I mean, there's been tons of articles too about like how Madden has changed the way you know, football intellectuals like think about the game. So I mean, it's this weird like. You know, the games first started trying to recreate reality, and then the reality started adapting to the existence of games.
I remember. Go ahead.
No, actually.
No, I'm not going to talk.
If you insist. It's interesting because on the totally flip side of that, I was just watching an NBA game and I saw a commercial where Tyson Chandler and a couple other players were saying, hey, we need to get kids to stop playing as many video games and start going outside. And at first I wanted to be like, rah, rah, no, video games are good. But like, when you think about it, it's like, I wonder how many kids these days are growing up with something like Madden or NBA or whatever it is, replacing that time that they might spend developing those actual sports skills. And while you can learn how football is played from Madden, you can't learn how to actually play football because you need to like practice those coordination skills and you need to train your body to be active and to get out there. So I wonder if there is a detrimental effect to that too.
Something to, the play 60 kind of movement that the NFL's been doing is just making sure you go out for an hour and get out there. But way to down it, man.
You Judas.
You totally Debbie Downer this whole panel.
Alright, that's it, time to go.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks, guys. And maybe Chris Cthulhu could be the new Jets quarterback.
I'll take anyone at this point. Anyone?
Speaking of insults, my question, I want you to think about...
This does not bode well, by the way. Don't do that open.
I want you to actually think about the league, that show that's on FX, when I asked this question. Like, me and my friends are all in the fantasy football league, and in the theme of the league, we pretty much talk the most outrageous garbage to each other. It's pretty brutal. If there were video cameras involved, it would probably get shut down really quick. But beyond that point, I know you guys were talking a lot about like how insulting and derogatory comments, you know, between fans and everything like that can put a hamper in things, but do you also believe, like, especially after watching that show, or if it's like a bunch of friends that just like, you know, just laugh hysterically about like all these comments that happen, do you think that that can actually bring, like, you know, people that are into these kind of things closer instead of farther apart in some way?
As long as everyone knows.
And because we live in an age where like there's internet trolling everywhere, so yeah.
Yeah, well, along with what Jason was saying, yeah, it's works for your community because it's a closed community and you guys know each other and you realize that you can't get hurt. Obviously, probably some people do get hurt every once in a while, but you know, like it's when it goes beyond that, or it is directed outwards at people that may not know the rules or whatever, that you know are not comfortable with the amount of language that's being thrown around. That's where it can really lead into problems. But I mean, it's kind of naive to think that professional athletes don't trash talk each other. I mean, they do. If you had a mic on of what's going on in the NBA games, they're constantly, you know, bitching. Look at Kevin Garnett; he's kind of a jerk.
Wes Walker's wife.
Yeah. So I mean, that kind of competitiveness and that fire is good. You're right, to a certain extent, but it can also lead to evil.
Okay, want to hear a Patriots joke?
No.
Do it.
All right, so driving to PAX, it said 100 miles away from your
It's a long joke?
Nope, very quick. It said 100 yards away from having to make my next direction. Unfortunately, everyone in Boston decided to make a lot of traffic and everything, and it took me 7 minutes, and then I thought, that's why the Patriots can't win Super Bowls anymore. It takes way too long for them to go over 100 yards to where they need to go.
Sit down.
That might have also been a Sim City joke, I'm not sure.
No, you can't have.
First, I just want to say, guys, this is an awesome panel. Had a ton of fun. It's really great things being brought up. Second of all, I'm a fellow Jets fan, so I feel your pain. Again, butt fumbles.
Yeah, I'm really sorry.
Did you say butt fondles?
Butt fumbles.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Pat fans know.
Awesome.
I'm a Jets fan, but I started the Pats defense that weekend in fantasy football, so it was great for me.
Good. Glad to hear.
On topic to that, I need help choosing a good team name for fantasy football. Last year, I was El Dirty Sanchez, which,
Child.
you know, it's charming, but you're going to let Sanchez so much. So any advice?
Manti Te'o's girlfriend.